Hello, in this video I'm going to be answering the question of whether Atlantis invented guns and gunpowder. Now, if you're not really familiar with the dialogues of Plato and you just have an understanding of Atlantis as defined by pop culture, you might say, of course, Atlantis had guns and gunpowder. They had advanced technology, and guns are a comparatively primitive form of technology that surely Atlantis must have had. But if you have actually read the dialogues of Plato and are more familiar with the real level of technology that is described in the narrative, then you would answer with a definitive no, because it specifically states in Plato's dialogues that the army and the military of Atlantis didn't have any firearms. Or so that's the conclusion that the vast majority of Atlantis scholars have reached. First of all, just a description of the invention of gunpowder in the actual historical timeline. Gunpowder was first invented in the 9th century AD by Chinese inventors, and the first military applications were developed at around 904 AD. So this technology is more than 1,000 years old. And based on what Plato said about the military of Atlantis, it's fairly evident, or it seems so, that the army did not have any firearms. It mentions chariots, shields, javelins, slingers, and it mentions ships and sailors. But there's this interesting phrase here that's been really overlooked, I believe, by many researchers, and that is these stone shooters. What are stone shooters? They're different from slings, obviously, because a sling and a stone shooter both hurl and throw stones, but it's specifically described as a stone shooter. Now, what is a stone shooter, for heaven's sake? It seems like it could possibly be a gun, because we are familiar with guns as shooting bullets, which are made of metal, obviously, but a gun doesn't have to necessarily shoot a bullet that's made of metal. It can shoot whatever it wants to, and a stone is sufficient for that purpose of of releasing a projectile at high speed, and that's the essential purpose of something that shoots. And so, what are these stone shooters? Are they guns or cannons? And my theory is that they are. And this is why I think that the stone shooters, as described by Plato, are probably guns. It's because we have all of these other weapons that are in the army of Atlantis, but notably, there are no bows and arrows. And bows and arrows are weapons that are very, very useful to have in an army because they allow you to attack at a distance. And so the idea that the army of Atlantis would just not have this extremely important weapon in their arsenal suggests that there was a substitute for that ranged weapon. And that ranged weapon, if there is no bow and arrow, but then there are these stone shooters, my guess is that these stone shooters are guns, and hence you have a weapon that's more effective than a bow and arrow in terms of its range capacity, and that's why you don't have the bows and arrows in the army of Atlantis. And so the question is, how many stone shooters are in this army, or how many men armed with firearms are in this army? Each leader of a district had to provide 3 stone shooters, and there are 60,000 districts in the plain of Atlantis, each that are 1 stadia by 1 stadia in size. And so, just multiplying those numbers together, you have 180,000 stone shooters. And if these really are guns, and each stone shooter had one weapon, then the army of Atlantis must have had 180,000 guns. This is not assuming that there are replacement parts, or that one member that one soldier could have more than one gun. But that's a minimum of 180,000 firearms that this army has. And that's an incredibly large number, right? Especially for a civilization that dates back to presumably 12,000 years ago. The idea that an army would have 180,000 stone shooters or guns would just make it an incredibly formidable army that would be able to easily conquer the world. And Atlantis is described as having almost done so, except for the fact that Athens stood in its way and ultimately defeated it. And this is just the royal city's army. You have to be governments for 10 total governments in total under the entire civilization. And each of those other 9 governments have their own armed forces, as is displayed by the quote right here. So we can estimate that the total number of armed men with these stone shooters would have been around 360,000 if we presume that the royal city had half of the entire population, or the half of the total armies, and that the other men with stone shooters as well. And if the army had guns, then why wouldn't the navy? And since the navy had 1,200 ships, as described by Plato's account, that's a lot of guns. That's a lot of potential ships and a lot of potential guns. You have to mind you that 1,200 ships is larger than the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars, when the era of the sailing ship was at its peak and in its prime. And so no modern navy has had more than 1,200 ships that were actually combat ships that were able to actually fight. And so there's another interesting quote in the description of Atlantis' army other than the stone shooters, and that's these heavily armed soldiers. And as Plato is describing the army, he mentions that the 2 heavy armed soldiers. What could this mean? And that's a total of 120,000 heavy armed soldiers if we multiply 2 by 60,000. Same thing as the stone shooters, they would have been described as such and just combined with them. If they are some combination of slings, javelins, and other primitive weapons also mentioned in the passage, then those weapons would have been redundant, right? Because you just have one soldier that's being weighed down with all of these weapons that the other soldiers already have. And so my idea is that this heavy armed soldier is referring to a weapon that the Egyptians and Greeks at the time the account was written down weren't really familiar with, so it wasn't able to be translated effectively. And I think it's a reference to weapons technology that's more powerful and more advanced than a typical firearm. For example, an explosive projectile like a grenade launcher or even mortars or artillery. And that's actually that stone shooters are guns. They must have had some form of gunpowder or explosive charge that would allow that stone to actually be projected. And so they must have had explosives at the same time. They would be able to launch those explosives and use those explosives as weapons. That's just the natural evolution of guns and gunpowder. It's a natural process of evolution that happened with us. So if Atlantis did that, they would have invented explosive projectiles then too. And so that, I believe, would make a truly formidable army. Not a modern army in any sense, because they still have horses and chariots, but it's certainly an army that would be powerful enough, that would be more powerful in a sense than even the armies of the 17th and 18th centuries. Analysis further. If Atlantis invented gunpowder, that means they would have invented explosives. They wouldn't have just used it for military purposes, but they would have used it to mine, for mining. And it was said in a quote in Plato's dialogues that they dug out of the earth whatever was to be found there, and that was referring to the mines of Atlantis, which produced an incredible amount of gold, silver, and this mineral, this ore called orichalcum. And this could be roughly translated to mountain copper. And so were they digging up all of this material and all of this wealth using their bare hands and shovels? Or were they actually using something else? And my guess is that something else is basically explosives. They were using explosives to actually um, to be able to mine more of the earth and to increase their productivity in their mining activities. And also in excavating canals, it was said that Atlantis built a ditch that was 100 feet deep, a stadia wide, and extended all the way around the plain of Atlantis, which was 10,000 stadia in perimeter. And I estimated and calculated the total amount of material that had to be excavated to unearth this canal to be 380 billion cubic feet, which is over 10 times the amount of material that went into building the Great Wall of China. So it's essentially a Great Wall of China that extends all the way around the world. It's that much amount of material that was excavated. And so, could they have done this using their bare hands or with primitive tools? Of course not. That would have taken that would have been. It's not just one Great Wall of China, but 10 Great Walls of China. And so my theory is that they had help. They had this explosive technology that they used to actually break apart the rock so that it could be used for, so that it could actually, they could actually create this kind of irrigation infrastructure. And what about the city itself? You have this area of, presumably this was solid rock, and you have these areas of depressed um, channels that formed parts of the city that were filled with water. And so how this was in a total 3 miles wide. How was this city constructed? Did they just use chisels or stone tools to excavate these canals and these channels? My guess is no, and that they used explosives to actually do this, and they used explosives to expedite this work and to carve out these rings. And so, having said what I said in this video, I want to preview what I'm going to be presenting in future videos. A quote from Saruman of Lord of the Rings, in which one states, Moria, you feared to go into those mines. The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep. You know what they awoke in the darkness of Khazad-dûm, shadow and flame. Now, this is just a metaphor for what I believe that the Atlanteans once did too. They used their mining activities eventually reached a point where they were destabilizing the entire geology of the region. And number two is if explosives were used by Atlantis for mining, for construction, what happened to the rubble and the waste rock that was generated? Because an enormous amount of rubble and waste rock would have been generated in the construction of those structures. And the idea is maybe they recycled it. And that is, if you're maybe anticipating what I'm, then go ahead and make your guess, but I'll be talking about these subjects in future videos.